Hi guys, in this tutorial we're gonna expand upon and use the skills that we've learnt in previous videos to now write a larger program, a sort of a game, but this time we're gonna look at how to split up the program into smaller functions, each function would take on a section of the task, a different part of the task, and then allow the functions to come together and work together to make this game. So the aim of this program is to let a user enter a minimum and maximum number, we've seen that before, and then also enter another number which represents a number of items. And what happens is a number of randomly chosen items between that minimum and maximum number are added to an empty list. And after this list is created, we let the user keep guessing a number that they think is in the list. So remember that list, we start off with an empty list and we add a certain number of randomly chosen numbers between the smaller and larger numbers, between the minimum and maximum range essentially. And so we let the user guess what they think is in the list, and they keep guessing until they get one right, at which point the program will stop. So we're going to have a look at writing this program, but in a way that splits up the program into different functions, different functionalities. So each function takes on a different task or part of the problem. So I've written out a template already. Don't worry about import random. That's just going to help us later on generate this random number. It's a detail you won't need to know at this stage, but I've just included it here because we're going to need it later. So I've got a function defined using the def keyword, defined the function getInt, which takes in a value called string prompt, and it's going to do something with that later. Then we've got a makeList function, which is going to take a larger value, and also a number of items, and it's going to do something with those three numbers. So this function takes in these three numbers and it's going to return something using those numbers. And then we've got a main function which hopefully brings these two parts together. So I'm just going to comment again, it's good practice. The first thing I want to do is get num1 and num2. We've seen this before. We're just going to say num1 equals int input, and we're going to do the same for num2 as well. So firstly, let's just get num1. Keep commenting. Remember, with inputs, usually they're treated as strings at first, but with int, the int function interprets that input or any value essentially as a number. So in order for me to get numbers from the user, I've written out this function called getInt, which takes in a string prompt, and we're going to see what that does in a sec. So I'm going to say temporary number, or it could really be called anything, equals int input, and print out the string prompt. So getInt takes in a string message. Usually we write out something like enter num1 or enter num2. That's what string prompt is going to be. It's going to be a string which has a message inside it, which is to be displayed to the user as they input the number. And temp number equals the integer that they input. And then we're going to return the temp number back to the main function. So number 1 is set to whatever is given by the getInt function, and the getInt function is given this parameter enter num1, that string. And we're going to do exactly the same thing for number 2. We're going to call the function getInt, give it the string parameter, which is enter num2, give it that string so that temp num is set to the input of the user when they see that string. And then we return temp num back to the function. So again, just to recap what the getIn function is doing, it's being given a string, and what happens is it prints that string and gets the number from the user according to what they input using their keyboard, and then it returns the number that the user inputted back to the main function which called it. So number 1 is set to whatever the user inputs, and number 2 accordingly. So now let's move on. So we've got our number 1 and number 2. Now we've seen this in previous programs. We're just going to use a simple if and else statement to find out which one of these two numbers is larger and which one is smaller. So let's establish these first. So I'm going to say if number 1 is less than number 2, declare the larger number as number 2 and smaller as number 1. Else, i.e. if that's not the case, we know that number 2 has to be bigger. We're expecting number 2 to be bigger. So smaller is set to number 2 and larger is set to number 1. This is something we've seen before. It should just be a recap of if and else statements using comparators or comparison operators. So we've got the user to enter two numbers, and we've established which one is larger and smaller. Now what we want is the user to enter a third number, which is the number of randomly chosen items they want to be added to this empty list. So using the getInt function, I'm going to declare the variable numItems. So I say getInt, and the string will be different this time. This time I'm going to say something like enter a number of items. So it's a different string parameter that I'm passing to the getInt function for it to display to the user and return me an integer number that they input. Enter a number of items to add to a list. Yep. So the getInt function, as I said, it displays this string prompt that it receives, and then sets temp_num to the input of the user, and then returns temp_num back to the main function and sets it to numItems. So far we've got our 3 inputs, and we've established smaller and larger, essentially a list, a range of values, a smaller and larger range. Now what I want to do is create a list of randomly selected numbers. So if for numItems the user was to input 5, what I want is a list of 5 randomly chosen items between smaller and larger. And if numItems was to happen to be 10, we want 10 items. So now I've defined this function called makeList. It takes in a smaller number, a larger number, and a number of items. It starts off by having a list which is an empty list. So start list is an empty list. And what I want to do is have a for loop going from 0 up to the number of items I want to add, and each time I want to find a random number within the range. And the way to work out random numbers or retrieve random numbers from Python is random.randint and then a minimum and maximum range. This particular detail is not the focus of this tutorial, it's just an extra thing I've added, but don't worry about it too much. Random.randint just generates a random value between the smaller and the larger number. A random integer, that is. So I'm going to set new num to this random number, and what I want to do is add new num to this list, to this empty list I have. So each time around the loop I want to generate a random number and add it to the start list. So the command here is, or the instruction or line rather here is start list dot append brackets new number. So that means add this new number to the end of this start list. And once this for loop is completed, once I've added num items, number of numbers essentially, once I've added items, num items times, that's when I know the list is complete. The random list has been generated, so I can return it back to the main function. So make list takes in these three parameters, we call them, and returns this one big list of random numbers. So my list equals whatever's returned by the make list function. So my list is set to whatever the make list function returns, given the parameters smaller, larger, and num of items. And again, I'm just commenting here just to say that my list is the randomly generated list of numbers. Carrying on from what we've done so far, we've been able to get two items, or two numbers rather, a larger and a smaller number from the user, and we've also asked them for a number of items they want to be added to the empty list. So we've been able to establish the smaller and the larger number, and then according to the user's input we can generate a list of random numbers essentially. That's what we've been able to do so far. So the next thing we want to do as part of this game is to have the user guess a number that they think is in our randomly chosen list or randomly generated list. So we want the user to input a number, and what we want to do is check if that number happens to be in our list or not. So for this I'm going to add a new function called checklist. So define checklist, def checklist, and I'm going to give it some parameters. I'm going to give it a list of items and an item to look for. So this is just an abstract sort of general function for now. It's going to be given a list called list of items, and it's going to be given an item itself, and what we want to do is find out if this item occurs in the list of items at all. So to find out if something occurs in the list, recall from previous videos the count function. So if I say list items.count item, that's going to give me the number of occurrences of item itself in the list of items. So if there's more than 0, if there's one or more occurrences of item in the list of items, then we know that item is indeed in the list of items. If not, we know that's not the case. So according to this, I'm going to return 1 or 0. So that's what checklist does. It's given a list and it's given an item, and if the item is in the list, exists in the list, then we return 1. If not, we return 0, denoting true or false. It doesn't have to be 1 and 0, it could be just any values you'd like really. But anyway, now what I want to do is have the user guess a number. So I'm going to say, using the getInt function again, I'm going to give it the string parameter or the string prompt, guess a number you think is in the list. So that message will be outputted to the user, and whatever the user inputs will be set to user guess. Now what I want to do is check whether this particular guessed number, the guess number, user guess, is within my list itself. So what I want to do, in fact, let's get rid of this while statement. We don't want that. What I'm going to do is use the checklist function to find out whether user guess exists within my list. So what I'm going to do is guess correct. So it's an indication of whether that guess was correct or not. Guess correct equals to whatever is returned by the checklist function when we give it my list, that list of numbers, and num items. And the user guess. So checklist will check that user guess exists in my list and will return 1 if that's true and return 0 if that's not true. That's what the checklist function does. So the program checks it and sets that 1 or 0 to guess correct, the variable guess correct. So what I'm going to do now is say if guess correct, while guess correct is 0, so essentially if they guessed incorrectly, and each time around the loop if they keep guessing incorrectly, we're going to repeat the process again, ask them to enter a value and check whether this value lies in that randomly generated list. So this loop is going to keep on going until at one point guess correct is set to the value 1, until essentially they make a guess and that guess happens to be in the list, happens to lie in the list. So that's what this while loop is doing. It's just going to keep on repeating the same process of the user guessing and checking that the user got it right or wrong. And if they got it right, this while loop, the condition will not be fulfilled, because in that case guess correct will be 0, will be 1. So that's an overview of the program that we've written so far. We've got separate functions to get input from the user. We then have a function which is used once just to make a list of random numbers according to the parameters that we give it. We have a function that checks the list for a particular item, whether it exists or not. And then we have a main function which brings everything together. So we've got make list, we give it the smaller and larger number and a number of items we want to add to the list, and we're returning a list back to the main function, which is set to my list, that we've seen before. Then we've got checklist, which uses the count.count function to see how many occurrences of a particular item lie within the list of items that were given. And as I mentioned, the main function brings everything together. So we start off getting two numbers, finding out which one's smaller and larger. We've seen that before. And asking for another input number of items. How many items between that range do we want to be added to the list? How many of these random numbers? Then we've got a list generating function, myList. So myList is the list and makeList is the function that makes the list, essentially. User guess, the user enters a guess, a number that they think happens to be within the list, and guess correct is a 1 or 0 value according to what the function checklist returns. So if I run my program, what I want to do is start off with the main function. So in the Python shell, I say main and empty brackets, and the program starts now, because remember the program, everything was brought together by the main function. So let's enter a number 1 and a number 2, 78 and 20, or maybe not 20, something else, 40. and the users also asked for a number of items to add to this list. So we want 10 random items between 40 and 78 to be added to this empty list. Now it's time to guess a number that might be in the list. So I say is, let's go for a guess. So 10 random numbers between this range. Okay, 40 happens not to be in the list. That's why it's asking me again. 70. Oh, that's a lucky guess. So 70 was a number that happens to be in the list, and that's why the program stops. I'm just going to go back to the code and edit something quickly just to make it clearer what's going on. So when we generate the list, what I'm going to do is now print out the list itself, just so I can see what's going on. In the real game, we probably don't want to print out the list because that's essentially giving away the answers, but for the purposes of seeing what's going on, I'm just going to print out my list. I'm just going to say comment in the actual game. We want to remove this line. So I'm going to actually print out the list and see what random numbers have been generated. So if I go back to running the program, and if I go main brackets, so start the program using the main function. So now let's enter a number 1. We could go for the same numbers, or we could just go for slightly different ones. So 20, and let's go for a -5. So between -5 and 20, I want 3 randomly chosen numbers, and these are the random numbers that have been added to this list. So I'm just going to keep on guessing until I happen to get one right. So in the real game, the user wouldn't know what numbers within the list. So 3 happens not to be in the list, 5 is not in the list, -2 is, and at that point the program realizes that the endpoint has been reached. We've got a correct guess, so therefore the program stops.